Hey everyone, this is Derrick Broze of the Conscious Resistance Network, and today we are going to be talking about one of my recent articles, which is coming from the Mind Unleashed, discussing the potential knowledge the US government had regarding experiments with coronavirus in China, and maybe even the possibility that China and the US government have been working hand in hand behind the scenes. But before we get into all that, I want to remind you guys to bookmark theconsciousresistance.com. This is my website that I've been working on since 2012, and as you guys can see, we've been doing some recent updates. We've updated all of our social media channels you can see here. We also added back our subscribe to our newsletter, which we recently took down. And there's just lots of updates happening. This is where you can get all of our books, articles, documentaries, and everything you need to know about the conscious resistance. And I also want to let you guys know that I did start a new Telegram channel for those of you who are on Telegram. It's actually not too new. I started it months ago. And it's just called Derrick Broze's Daily News because I read a whole lot of articles, I watch a whole lot of videos, and I don't always choose to make videos on them or write articles on them, but they could be extremely relevant to, the world, and you might want to know about them. So I will post that link in the show notes, and it is now listed in all of the descriptions of the video. Just scroll down and you'll see something that says join Derrick Broze Daily News Telegram channel. And so if you're on Telegram, you click that link and you can be added to it. And so let's get right into this. This is an article I published yesterday, Monday, April 13th. New reports indicate U.S. and China collaborated on coronavirus research prior to COVID-19 outbreak. The new reports indicate the U.S. government helped fund research in Wuhan that may be linked to COVID-19. So I will go through here and read a little bit of what I wrote. Of course, I'll put the actual article, and it contains a bunch of different links that I put together. Of course, this has been reported in some places in the mainstream, but what I try to do is to take some of the things the mainstream might choose to cover, or maybe they totally ignore, and to provide more context. So, despite months of constant news coverage telling the public the source of the novel coronavirus SARS-CoV-2, which is the official name for it, was seafood markets located in Wuhan, China, mounting evidence indicates the origin of the virus may be related to joint research funded by the United States and Chinese governments. New records viewed by the Mail on Sunday, studies examining the outbreak of the virus, and questions posed by an increasing amount of researchers are poking holes in the narrative put forth by the government and media. On Saturday, Mail on Sunday reported that scientists with the Wuhan Institute of Virology experimented on bats as part of a project funded by the U.S. National Institute of Health. The Mail reported that they have obtained documents detailing the relationship between the Wuhan Institute and the NIH, including the use of U.S. funding to carry out research on bats. The Wuhan Institute also worked with the University of Alabama, the University of North Texas, Harvard University, and the National Wildlife Federation. The documents reportedly detail how the U.S. government provided a $3.7 million grant for the Wuhan Institute to experiment on bats which were captured from caves in Yunnan, I'm not sure how you say that exactly, more than 1,000 miles away from Wuhan. According to the Mail, scientists working with funds from the U.S. National Institute of Health grew a strain of coronavirus in a lab and injected it into piglets. The reports also states that after some piglets died, they were fed to the remaining piglets. The importance of this connection to the caves in Yunnan cannot be overstated. According to a recent genetic analysis of the novel coronavirus genome, it is 96% identical at the whole genome level to a bat coronavirus. The study, a pneumonia outbreak associated with a new coronavirus of a probable bat origin, also connected COVID-19 to a coronavirus originating from Yunnan. The study stated, quote, "We then found that a short region of the RNA-dependent RNA polymerase, RDRP, from a bat coronavirus, which was previously detected in Rhinophilus affinis from Yunnan province, showed high sequence identity to 2019 novel coronavirus." So basically, as I said there, they're saying that the genome of this coronavirus, COVID-19, is 96% identical to a bat coronavirus that was previously identified out of the caves of Yunnan, about 1,000 miles away from Wuhan. And following these revelations, U.S. Representative Matt Gaetz called for an end to U.S. government funding of, quote, cruel animal experiments at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which may have contributed to the global spread of COVID-19. While these new revelations counter the mainstream narrative regarding the origin of the virus, they actually do line up with previous studies, and I know some of you guys have seen this. In late February, UPI reported that Chinese authorities said the first patient known to contract the novel coronavirus had no connection to the seafood market in Wuhan. Quote, Eastern Broadcasting Company and Liberty Times reported Thursday that China's first patient had shown symptoms of COVID-19 as early as December 8th. Chinese authorities had previously said the outbreak began on December 31st. Additionally, UPI reported that a research team with China's Sichuanbana Tropical Botanical Garden, Hunan Agricultural College, and the Chinese Institute for Brain Research have also said that the seafood market is not the source of COVID-19, which is what myself and others have been saying since the beginning. And if you guys remember what my whiteboard, I've said that I think that the most likely theory is that this is some sort of bioengineered weapon or biowarfare. Both the U.S. and Chinese governments have been tight-lipped on potential alternative explanations for the origin of the novel coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2, and the COVID-19, which is the resulting disease. Both nations have also been quick to dismiss the idea that either were involved in developing any sort of germ or biowarfare, except when accusing each other of funding such projects. In fact, a recent report from The Guardian details how 2 websites for Chinese universities recently published and then removed pages referencing a new policy requiring all academic papers related to COVID-19 to be submitted for extra vetting prior to publication. Professor Steve Sang, director of the SOAS Chinese Institute in London, told The Guardian, quote, in terms of priority, controlling the narrative is more important than public health or the economic fallout. It doesn't mean the economy and public health aren't important, but the narrative is important. So the Chinese government and the U.S. government are more worried about shaping the narrative than dealing with public health or the coming and current economic fallout. Now, I made some connections here that may or may not be directly connected. This is my speculation, not baseless, because there is some basis to lay this on, but in the end it might not be true. But either way, this is where we're going with it. Many of you have heard about the arrests of Harvard professor Charles Lieber back in, I believe, February, and you've heard that he was arrested with or detained with 2 other Chinese nationals who were also charged in this incident. But perhaps this is related to it. Let's get into that a little bit. So, first of all, just to recap, we have new evidence from the Mail on Sunday, documents they viewed, as well as other corroborating evidence showing that the U.S. government was funding research into coronavirus regarding bats in Wuhan, the Wuhan Institute of Virology. So you have a connection to Wuhan, you have a connection to experimenting with bats and piglets, funded by the U.S. government, helping the Chinese prior to this outbreak. So that, I think, indicates that there could have been something that escaped from the lab or was purposefully released. But let's take a look at this. The revelations regarding the U.S. funding of Chinese research into viruses spawned from bats and the attempts at controlling the narrative are sure to rekindle theories regarding the arrest of a Harvard professor who has been accused of lying about his connections to the Chinese government's 1,000 Talents Plan, an effort to attract Chinese scientists and entrepreneurs back to their homeland. Harvard Department Chair Charles Lieber is alleged to have accepted more than $1 million in grant money from the Chinese government. Harvard University called the charges against him extremely serious. Lieber was arrested on January 28th, and as I said, 2 Chinese nationals were also charged and were detained in the process. Or one of them, I think, is currently in China. Although it is not yet clear evidence that Lieber was arrested in relation to research related to COVID-19, his arrest does deserve further scrutiny. First, according to the statement from the Department of Justice, since 2008, Lieber received more than $50 million in grant funding from the National Institute of Health and the Department of Defense, which require the disclosure of, quote, significant foreign financial conflicts of interest. The complaint states that beginning in 2011, Lieber also became a strategic scientist at Wuhan University of Technology in China and was a contractual participant in China's 1,000 Talents Plan in or about 2012 to 2017. So the connections we have is the Harvard professor, Charles Lieber, was involved with research at the National Institute of Health. He was involved with the Chinese 1,000 Talents Plan, which was trying to lure back not only Chinese nationals back home and get some of their research, but even maybe American scientists as well. So you have the U.S. government, through the National Institute of Health, funding research into coronavirus at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. You have an American professor at Harvard working with the Chinese government through the 1,000 Talents Plan and also receiving grant money from the National Institute of Health and the Department of Defense. So there's connections there. This complaint connects Lieber to research in Wuhan, his involvement with the NIH, which was also funding Chinese research into bats, and makes clear his involvement with the Thousand Talents Plan. The DOJ describes the Thousand Talents Plan as, quote, one of the most prominent Chinese talent recruit plans that are designed to attract, recruit, and cultivate high-level scientific talent in furtherance of Chinese scientific development. These talent programs seek to lure Chinese overseas talent and foreign experts to bring their knowledge and experience to China and reward individuals for stealing proprietary information. Although the complaint alleges that Lieber lied about his involvement with the program in April 2018, which was prior to the COVID-19 outbreak, his involvement with the program continued into 2019. If Lieber had been involved with Chinese research into bats, or secretly funneling out U.S. research into viruses, he would have been working on such matters prior to the outbreak. And although the Facebook fact-checkers factcheck.org states, quote, while his work has recently focused on coming up with novel ways of using nanowires in cells, he is not a biologist, nor does he have expertise in viruses. I found a 2004 report which quotes Lieber as researching nanowires for detecting the presence of viruses. Coincidentally, in that same 2004 report, he states, quote, viruses are among the most important cause of human disease and are of increasing concern as possible agents of biowarfare and bioterrorism. So he was, at least to some degree, involved in researching viruses or understanding viruses, even if it was just through the nanowires, which is a whole other interesting topic that maybe we'll save for another day. And he specifically mentioned the concerns around biowarfare and bioterrorism. Now, I found a report from Nature Index which reported that an April 2018 hearing organized by the U.S. House of Representatives, where Michael Wessel, the commissioner of the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission, asked Congress to cut federal grants, loans, or otherwise assistance to participants of the Thousand Talents Plan. Additionally, Representative Lamar Smith, who is a chairman of the House Committee on Science, Space, and Technology, also warned that China was, quote, using sleeper agents at our research universities to steal our scientific breakthroughs. Further, Nature Index also notes that Francis Collins, director of the National Institute of Health, sent a letter to thousands of research institutes in August 2018 warning that foreign nations were attempting to use, quote, systematic programs to influence NIA researchers and peer reviewers. He doesn't specifically mention China, but I think it's clear. And in my final thoughts in this article, when considering these warnings in conjunction with Lieber's arrest and involvement with the Thousand Talents Plan, it's easy to understand why some researchers and readers believe there might be an as-yet unproven connection between Lieber, the U.S. NIH funding of experiments in China, and the Chinese government's plan to influence scientists within the U.S. The U.S. and Chinese governments have both been accused of lying about the true impact of SARS-CoV-19, and the public has increasing distrust for media reports that are often seen as exaggerated or downplayed. All of this begs the following questions. Was Lieber involved with the research into bats found in the caves of Yunnan? What was the true nature of the U.S. government-sponsored experiments at the Wuhan Institute of Virology? And how deep did this collaboration between the governments go? Does the truth about the origins of SARS-CoV-19 and COVID-19 relate to these experiments? The answers to these questions remain to be seen, but the public must continue to question the narratives that are being spun right in front of our eyes. So, I think, well, let me go in one more story before I give you my personal opinions. This one was just published this morning by the Washington Post, for whatever it's worth. It says that State Department cables warned of safety issues at Wuhan labs studying bat coronaviruses. So what we're getting here is that according to U.S. Embassy officials and to newly released cables, U.S. Embassy officials visited a Chinese research facility in Wuhan several times and sent 2 official warnings back to Washington about inadequate safety at the lab, which was conducting risky studies on coronaviruses from bats. These cables have fueled discussions inside the U.S. government about whether this or another Wuhan lab was actually the source of the virus, which again is what we've been saying here for a while and many other researchers as well. In January 2018, the U.S. Embassy in Beijing took the unusual step of repeatedly sending U.S. science diplomats to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And there's that same place again, which was the same place that Lieber was working with and that we heard from the Daily Mail, the Mail on Sunday, that the U.S. government was funding the Wuhan Institute of Virology with $3.7 million grant. And that institute had in 2015 become China's first laboratory to achieve the highest level of international bioresearch safety. The Wuhan Institute of Virology issued a news release in English about the last of these visits, which occurred on March 27, 2018. The U.S. delegation, the Wuhan Institute of Virology last week erased that statement from its website, although it remains archived on the internet. What the U.S. officials learned during their visits concerned them so much that they dispatched 2 diplomatic cables categorized as sensitive but unclassified back to Washington. The cables warned about safety and management weaknesses at the Wuhan Institute Virology lab and proposed more attention and help. The first cable, which the Post writer says he obtained, also warns that the lab's work on bat coronaviruses and their potential human transmission represented a risk of a new SARS-like pandemic. Now, this piece seems to be essentially basically kind of putting the blame on the Chinese and saying that, they were experimenting on these things and studying these things, and the U.S. government tried to warn that it might not be safe. But my guess is they don't actually acknowledge what the other story I just covered, which is that the U.S. government was helping fund some of these things. And, they go on to explore this. And they basically say the origin story is not about blame. It's crucial to understanding how the novel coronavirus pandemic started because that informs how to prevent the next one. The Chinese government must be transparent and answer the questions about Wuhan labs because they are vital to our scientific understanding. So again, they're basically just pointing the finger at the Chinese government. It says, we don't know whether the novel coronavirus originated in the Wuhan lab, but the cable pointed to the danger there and increases the impetus to find out. I don't think it's a conspiracy theory. I think it's a legitimate question that needs to be answered, and to understand exactly how this originated is critical knowledge for preventing this in the future. So, the mainstream seems to be ignoring the Mail on Sunday's report that the U.S. government was actually funding some of this research, and instead, through these new cables, pointing the finger at the U.S. or at the Chinese government, saying, "Well, we tried to warn people that this was, a potential happening." Now, I think what we're going to end up seeing is that whatever ends up happening when this whole thing wraps up and we go back to quote-unquote normal or the new normal, there will be a commission, a COVID-19 commission, just like the 9/11 commission, which will examine all this. And I guarantee you they're going to look at it just like 9/11 and say, well, none of us could have predicted that this would have happened, and they're going to see how things could have gone wrong. And instead of, like 9/11, showing that, well, maybe they had a hand in this, maybe people in the government helped it happen, or at least allowed it to happen, they're going to say, well, we didn't get proper research, our agencies didn't communicate, and this is something we need to fix with more bureaucracy, more government. So I expect that to happen with this. They're going to tell us that it was all a mistake, it was just a problem of bureaucracy, and we can fix it if we just have more government. That's always going to be the answer in these cases. I also want to put forward the potential that since we know now, or at least we have one report, and we need more evidence, and we'll see what happens, or see if anybody comes up with more sources, that the U.S. government did give a $3.7 million grant to the Chinese government, the Wuhan Institute of Virology, to study coronaviruses with bats. Perhaps this indicates that there is more cooperation with the Chinese and U.S. government than previously thought. And I don't even mean just on the level of trade. I mean, when we're talking about this quote-unquote new world order, old world order, whatever you want to call it, global totalitarian government, there's often a discussion about whether the Chinese and the U.S. are actually opposing forces, and it's just two different superpowers who both want to control the people, but which one's actually going to get in control. I've also kept in the back of my mind the potential that it truly is all a charade, and that the U.S. government, the Chinese government, the Russian government, and most of them are all working together behind the scenes, while these conflicts are really just part of the show, part of the charade. And for me, this gives me some of that feeling. The U.S. government is helping fund experiments on bats and pigs into coronavirus, and the World Military Games, Event 201, Crimson Contagion, I mean, all these different things. Perhaps this is a scheme of collaboration, or the U.S. government was helping fund the Chinese government's experiments on these things. They did indeed send some warning saying this could go bad. And when it did go bad in China, and maybe even earlier in the U.S., because now we have some reports saying that Wuhan wasn't even the original source of the virus, and that maybe it started in California, that the two governments collaborated to cover up this whole thing and to at least keep it from their people. And of course, the World Health Organization played a role as well. But I'll let you guys share your thoughts and comments below and let me know what you think about this whole thing. What do you think about the U.S. government funding What do you think about these cables? Do you think the Chinese and the U.S. government are working together, or is this just all the Chinese Communist Party's fault, as I know some of you guys like to think? I don't know. I don't know at the moment, but I do think this is another important piece of the puzzle that I hope people will think about and share. And that's where we're going to leave it today, guys. Please remember to subscribe to our newsletter, follow us on all of our social media channels, and if you want to join our Telegram channel, then look for that in the description below the video. Until next time, guys, remember, you are powerful, you are beautiful, and you are free. Peace.